And joining us now, journalist and author Paula Ramos. She is contributor for MSNBC and Noticias Telemundo. Also joining us is independent reporter and former Washington Post columnist, my former colleague, Philip Bump. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, guys. It appears that the apocalypse that Republicans were predicting was going to happen did not happen. But Paula, what did you see yesterday on the streets?
So I was coming back from the Rio Grande Valley. So I spent the last week in the valley. And so a lot of people came out there, right? I think it's important to look at some of the most vulnerable places to really understand whether or not they were silenced by fear. And I think yesterday was a type of barometer. How far gone are we or not? There has been many ICE raids. It's full of checkpoints, extremely militarized, and yet people showed up. 1,000 people came out. There were protests in at least 3 parts of the Rio Grande Valley. But what sticks with me is what I felt is the sort of the trauma of the children that have been watching their parents live in the shadows. And it reminded me of Arizona's Joe Arpaio.
Imagine a 5-year-old boy in a bunny-shaped winter hat. He is not on a playground or in a classroom. He is standing in a snowy Minnesota driveway, his small hand gripped by a federal agent. Behind him, his father is being detained under a federal initiative known as Operation Metro Surge. This single image, captured in February 2026, has become a flashpoint in a much larger debate about the limits of executive power in America. It is a moment that asks us to look past the slogans and the headlines to see how institutional standards are shifting in real time. This isn't just a story about immigration. It is a story about the very architecture of American democracy and what happens when the people decide that the traditional boundaries of power are being rewritten. If you value deep analysis of the norms that hold our system together, consider subscribing to this channel for more independent evaluations of U.S. political power. Let's play this clip.
And I was thinking about this effect that you have in Arizona, right, where Joe Arpaio essentially gave rise, right, to a whole new generation of people, of young people that watched their parents being criminalized, that held onto the trauma, and that then were able to turn that into political power. And that's what reminds me in the Rio Grande Valley, right? There's a whole generation of people that came out.
That's interesting, because I was trying to talk to you about this morning, Eugene, but we got to talking about something else. But to me, it feels like we went through a whole week where Republicans, through their rhetoric, tried to plant the seeds for something. They're anti-American, they're this, they're that, they hate America.
On a cold morning in Minneapolis, the ground shifted. It didn't happen because of an earthquake or a storm, but because of a series of events that would eventually bring millions of Americans into the streets. To understand why the United States is currently witnessing the largest coordinated protest movement in its history, we have to look at the specific incidents that broke the seal on public patience. We have to look at the killing of Renee Good. Renee Good was a 37-year-old woman sitting in her car on January 7, 2026. According to documented reports, an ICE agent named Jonathan Ross fired 3 shots into her vehicle as she was turning away from him. Within hours, the city of Minneapolis was in a state of civil unrest. This was not an isolated tragedy. It was the first domino in a sequence that included the shooting of 2 unarmed people by Border Patrol agents in Portland just 24 hours later. Then, on January 24th, another killing occurred back in Minneapolis. Alex Preddy, an intensive care nurse for the Department of Veterans Affairs, was shot multiple times by federal agents. These were not just local police matters. These were actions taken by agents of the federal government operating under a set of new aggressive directives known as Operation Metro Surge and Operation Salvo. The significance of these operations cannot be overstated. They represent a departure from traditional law enforcement norms characterized by a centralized executive authority that many critics argue mimics the trappings of a monarchy. In fact, the White House's own social media during this period posted imagery depicting Donald Trump as a king, accompanied by claims of divine right. This brings us to the core of the current crisis. In a democracy, the rule of law is supposed to be the final arbiter, but when the executive branch begins to use monarchical terminology and asserts a divine right to rule, the institutional standard of accountability is put to the test. The response from the American public has been a movement that chose a very specific and deliberate name: No Kings. The No Kings movement is not just a protest group, it is a coalition of over 200 organizations, including the ACLU, labor unions, and faith leaders, all affirming that power in the United States belongs to the people, not to an individual. When we look at the numbers, the scale is staggering. In June 2025, more than 5 million people participated in protests across 2,100 cities. By October, that number had grown to as many as 7 million participants. Some analysts estimate that nearly 3.7% of the entire U.S. population has demonstrated against the administration since the start of its second term. But why no kings? Why that specific phrasing? It is a direct response to the unitary executive theory being practiced by the administration. This legal theory suggests that the president has near total control over the executive branch, effectively removing the traditional checks and balances provided by independent agencies and career civil servants. When the administration strikes down local policies like New York's congestion pricing and refers to the president as king in official communications, the public sees a shift in the basic contract of American governance. We see this tension playing out in the streets and in the courtrooms. In Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey have found themselves under investigation by the Department of Justice. Their alleged crime? Conspiracy to impede federal immigration agents. This investigation followed comments they made criticizing ICE's conduct and calling for peace. When the federal government uses the DOJ to investigate elected state and local leaders for expressing political disagreement, the norm of federalism, the balance of power between states and the national government, is being strained to a breaking point. The human cost of this institutional friction is perhaps most visible in the story of Karen Gutierrez Castellanos. Karen was a 26-year-old woman living in Austin, Texas. She did what we are all taught to do when there is trouble. She called 911 to report a disturbance in her neighborhood. But instead of receiving protection, Karen and her 5-year-old son were detained by ICE after a local officer identified an administrative warrant in a federal database. They were removed from the country. This incident strikes at a fundamental democratic norm, the idea that public safety depends on trust between the community and the law. When calling for help results in deportation, that trust collapses. Reporting suggests that nearly 15% of K-12 students in Texas have at least one undocumented parent. When these families see the police not as protectors, but as an extension of federal enforcement, they stop reporting crimes, they stop sending their children to school, and they withdraw from the civic life that sustains a healthy society. And then there is Liam. 5-year-old Liam Conejo Ramos was the boy in the bunny hat. He was detained alongside his father in a Minneapolis driveway during a federal operation. School officials, including a superintendent and a board member, were present and offered to take custody of the child so he wouldn't have to go to a detention center. They were refused. Liam was taken to a family detention facility in San Antonio, Texas, where he remained for over 3 weeks. The detention of a 5-year-old U.S. resident who has committed no crime raises profound questions about the standard of child welfare in federal operations. Psychologists have noted that such experiences hijack a developing brain, creating a state of hypervigilance that makes learning impossible. When fear becomes a primary guide for public policy, the institutional focus shifts from the protection of rights to the demonstration of force. Vice President J.D. Vance, during a visit to Minnesota, defended these actions. His argument was framed as a matter of simple law enforcement. If someone has violated the law, they must be arrested, regardless of whether they have children. But the No Kings movement argues that this logic ignores the basic procedural standards that define a free society. They argue that the militarization of neighborhoods using 2,000 federal agents for a single operation in a major city is less about law enforcement and more about a display of very big force designed to suppress dissent. This brings us to the role of the media and the First Amendment. In January 2026, journalist Don Lemon was covering a protest at City's Church in St. Paul. Protesters had disrupted a service because the pastor was allegedly an official for ICE. The Department of Justice moved to charge those involved, including Lemon, with violations of the FACE Act and conspiracy, While a federal magistrate judge initially rejected the charges against Lemon, the Attorney General eventually directed federal agents to arrest him and several others. The arrest of a journalist for reporting on a public protest is a direct challenge to the freedom of the press. It signals that the administration is willing to use federal criminal law to target those who document opposition to its policies. When the Justice Department personally calls a court to demand a review of a judge's decision not to sign arrest warrants, as happened in the Lemon case, the independence of the judiciary is also called into question. Now we must look at how the administration is managing its own legal challenges. While federal agents are being deployed in neighborhoods, the president's personal legal team has been engaged in an unprecedented effort to use the powers of the presidency to escape accountability. In New York, where the president was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, his lawyers have attempted to move the case to federal court. Their goal is to have the conviction thrown out based on the Supreme Court's 2024 ruling on presidential immunity. U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein has been notably skeptical of this strategy. During a hearing in February 2026, Hellerstein criticized the legal team for seeking two bites at the apple. He noted that the crimes in question, hush money payments to hide an affair before an election, were private conduct, not official presidential acts. The judge signaled that the delay tactics, which have been a hallmark of the president's legal strategy for years, were running into a wall of judicial standards. This is a critical point of comparison. On one hand, we see a federal government asserting that the president is above the law when it comes to his own criminal conduct. On the other hand, we see that same government using every single tool we have to target individuals and families who lack political power. This disparity in the application of justice is what is driving the record-breaking protests. The scale of the No Kings protests is, by many accounts, the largest single-day political protest in American history, excluding perhaps the 1970 Earth Day events. In October 2025, there were more than 2,700 locations involved. The turnout was especially high in major cities like Washington, D.C. and New York, but it also reached deep into rural and conservative areas. In Montana, over 16,000 people protested in 29 different towns. In Alaska, thousands rallied in Anchorage and Fairbanks. What is also notable is the demographic shift. Survey data from these protests show that the participants are not just radical activists. They are highly educated, they are predominantly female, and they are largely white. They are the backbone of the American middle class, and they are expressing a profound sense that the country has gotten far off track. There is, however, a more troubling trend in the data, support for the idea that Americans may have to resort to violence to save our country has seen a significant shift. Among left-leaning Americans, support for this sentiment has risen to 26%. This is a chilling statistic. It suggests that as institutional standards break down and the rule of law appears to be failing, more people are losing faith in nonviolent democratic processes, yet the actual participants in the No Kings protests have consistently rejected this path. In October, the proportion of the crowd who explicitly rejected political violence surged to 59%. The organizers have been meticulous about training their volunteers in de-escalation and nonviolent action. They emphasize that their goal is to affirm democracy, not to destroy it. This tension between a growing public sentiment that violence might be necessary and a protest movement dedicated to nonviolence is the intellectual fault line of the current moment. The administration has responded to these protests with threats of its own. In January 2026, the president threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to suppress the demonstrations in Minnesota. The Insurrection Act is a 200-year-old law that allows the president to deploy the military domestically to restore order. Invoking it against peaceful protesters would be an extraordinary use of executive power, one that hasn't been seen in modern American history for such a purpose. We also see the administration using economic and social media tools to exert control. There have been reports of federal grants being frozen, mass layoffs at government agencies, and the censorship of online resources that don't align with the administration's views. Even popular late-night television shows, like Jimmy Kimmel Live, have faced suspensions. When the tools of government are used to punish cultural and political critics, the boundary between the state and the individual is further eroded. The international community is also watching. No tyrants and no dictators protests have been held in countries like Germany, Japan, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. In London, hundreds of people gathered under the banner of No Tyrants to show solidarity with American protesters. These international events are a reminder that the stability of the American system has implications far beyond its own borders. As we look toward the future, the No Kings Coalition has announced a third mass mobilization for March 28, 2026. They are aiming for 9 million participants. The flagship event will be held in the Twin Cities, the site of the killings that sparked this latest wave of unrest. The goal, according to organizers, is to turn the current reign of terror into a raucous, joyful, and nonviolent but powerful display of what America's all about. But the path to March 28 is not just about showing up in the streets. It is about the muscle and sophistication of a pro-democracy movement. It involves digital organizing, training people to document federal agents safely, and putting pressure on elected officials in Congress to demand the resignation of high-ranking leaders like DHS Secretary Kristi Noem. It is an effort to re-engage with the institutions that are currently under strain. So, where does this leave us? We are in a period of intense institutional testing. The rule of law is being challenged by a unitary executive theory that seeks to bypass traditional checks. The standard of public safety is being undermined by a collapse of trust in immigrant communities. And the First Amendment is being tested by the arrest of journalists and the investigation of state leaders. The 2026 protests are not just a reaction to a single policy, they are an evaluation of the nature of power in America. They represent a refusal to accept the trappings of a monarchy in a system designed for a presidency. When 7 million people take to the streets, they are performing a vital function in a democracy. They are acting as a final check on the exercise of power. In the case of Liam, the 5-year-old boy, there was a small victory. After more than 3 weeks in detention, a federal judge ordered his release while the family's asylum case remains pending. His aunt called his freedom a win for humanity, but for many other families, there is no such judge and no such order. They remain in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the next operation. The role of an independent political analyst is to look at these developments through the lens of norms and standards, and through that lens, the picture is clear. The traditional boundaries of American political power are being pushed to their limits. The question for the coming months is whether the institutions, the courts, the states, and the people will hold those boundaries, or whether a new, more monarchical standard will take their place. The No Kings movement has already made its choice. They are choosing to affirm that this nation belongs to its people. They are choosing to believe that democracy is worth the struggle of constant vigilance and massive coordination, and they are choosing to do so nonviolently, even as the rhetoric of violence grows around them. As we watch the events leading up to the March 28 mobilization, we should pay close attention to the courtrooms in New York and the streets of Minneapolis. These are the battlegrounds where the definition of American power is being settled. Whether it is a judge calling out 2 bites at the apple or 1 million people marching in Boston, these are the moments that will determine the future of the rule of law in the United States. The story of 2026 is still being written. It is a story of a country wrestling with its identity, its values, and its laws, and it is a story that reminds us that in a government of, by, and for the people, the final word does not belong to a king, but to the citizens who refuse to let the crown be worn. Thank you for joining me for this analysis. If you found this evaluation of our democratic norms useful, please leave a comment with your thoughts on the current state of the rule of law. We will continue to monitor these developments as they unfold. Good night.